Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 12. So now we are going to begin a series of chapters that are going to feel very different than everything else that we've covered before in these last 4 chapters. So some of you may be even wondering, well, what is the vestibular system? Is that actually a sense? Because usually when we're taught our senses, in 3rd grade or whatever, we learn about 5, right? We don't learn about this one. So let's talk a little bit about why that might be. So I put this on here as kind of a cool way to start the chapter. Is the Dizzy Bat Challenge. Get a chance to look at it whenever you have a moment. But basically the gist is you have these guys who put their foreheads on bats and then kind of spin around and then have to try to do something. As you might expect, they get really dizzy and they fall down a lot. And so I want you to be thinking throughout this chapter, why does that happen? Why is it that whenever people spin around a lot, that they get really, really dizzy and want to fall down? Alright, so as I was mentioning, the next couple of chapters are very different than anything we've covered so far this semester. For one, these 4 chapters are kind of abbreviated. They're pretty short, especially compared to what's in the textbook. What I'm going to be talking about in these chapters are a little bit kind of cut down. I try to take out some of the more technical aspects of it, and we just don't go into as much depth as you might in vision or in hearing. But on the other hand, the things that I like about that, though, is that means that we get to kind of like move through the chapter, kind of pick out the most interesting points, and think about the real world applications to those things. So it's kind of like it's like a buffet. We get to pick our favorite parts of these next couple of chapters of these remaining 4 senses. The reason why we go into this stuff a little bit less is because, for one, on average, we know a little bit less about vestibulation and about touch and about smell compared to vision. We just know less about it. But on the other hand, as psychologists, we're less likely to deal with some of these things in our kind of psychological careers than most people. So because we're not going to deal with it that much whenever you graduate, we're only going to focus really on the basics, and we're going to focus on how it applies to the real world. Alright, so let's get into it. Now, previously, in Chapter 9, you may remember we were talking about the cochlea. We were talking about the structure, the anatomy of the ear. And then I mentioned offhand something about this part right here. So, this little kind of squid-looking thing. And I said, we'll come back to that. This is where we're coming back to it. This is called the vestibular system. So we have kind of our inner ear. We have the cochlea, which is kind of the spiral, and then this thing connected to it is completely different. It is for a different sense. So the vestibular system is going to provide us a sense of balance. That sense of balance is how we are able to wake up, sit up in our bed, not fall out of bed, how we can stand up straight, walk around without worrying about falling. So that sense of balance that we all have, that is from our vestibular system. So basically, if you know what balance is, this is the textbook definition: postural control by which weight is evenly distributed, allowing us to remain upright and stable. Basically, when I read that, all that it means to me is that we don't fall down. But it also provides a sense of movement in different directions. So it provides us a sense of movement, of motion linearly, angular, and tilt. And we'll talk about what those 3 different variations of motion are in just a moment. And it also allows for the vestibular ocular reflex, which is how when we move our heads, we can kind of see things stably. We see things very clearly. However, whenever something is moving in front of us, it becomes blurry. We'll talk more about that in another video. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about let's talk a little bit about these different kinds of motion. What we're going to be talking about in this video is going to be some basics of movement, but we'll also be talking about the anatomy. Before we get there, much like in the other chapters, we need to talk about what is the physical stimulus that we are actually detecting. So previously we talked about what light is, we talked about what sound is. Now we need to talk about what orientation is. So we have three different types. We have angular motion, we have linear motion, and we have tilt. Angular motion you can think of as kind of like shaking your head side to side. No. So like that. So moving your head around. Or if you were in your chair and to spin, that would be angular motion. Linear motion, on the other hand, is if you were to move your head forward, like that, closer or farther back, or to just move it to the left or to the right. So you're not moving your head kind of, at any degree. You're just moving it forward, backwards, left, right, or even up and down. That's linear motion. And so you can think of that as kind of like driving in a car, right? Whenever you're driving in a car, you can detect that you're moving because you're sitting completely still. You're not actually moving, but you can detect movement because you are moving forward through space. And finally, tilt. Tilt is the sense of moving up and down, but it's really kind of not up and down like on an elevator, but up and down like this. So like moving your head like that. So that would be tilt. Okay, so three different things, and these are important to know. So angular motion is like spinning around. Linear motion is like moving forward and backwards, or getting on an elevator and moving up and down. And tilt is the sense of kind of curving up and down like you're nodding your head. Or if you're trying to look at your armpit. Maybe that's a good way of thinking about it. That's tilt. Alright, so that's how we know where we are, and you can kind of see how we have these different axes. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But it's important to know that there are three axes. So in our three-dimensional world, there are three different axes, where we have the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. For all of this, though, a key component is gravity. Without gravity, we would lose some of the ability to detect where we are. So think of gravity as a constant. Even though it is there with us all the time, it's really easy to forget, but it is going to tell us a lot about where we are. And so we have this constant force that is pulling us down. So keep that in mind when we talk about the anatomy. So if you were to try to read something like this, would you be able to? Yes, you would basically tilt your head 90 degrees and read it. But whenever you're doing that, if you have your face pressed up close enough against the screen, that would be all that you see. It's just these words, and it might look like you are right side up. So if you were to tilt your head, get close to the screen, and that's what you read, your eyes, your visual field, are telling you that you are right side up. But you know that you're not right side up, right? Part of it is because, let's face it, your neck muscles are going to be strained, right? But the other part of that is that you sense internally that you are tilted at an angle, that you are turned in some way. And the same as like if you were suspended by your ankles and you are upside down. Everything to you, your visual field, could look right side up. Let's say that you are, and it's pitch black, and so you're tilted upside down. You still know that you're tilted upside down, even though your visual field is telling you, for all you know, that you're right side up. So we still know. And the reason why we still know is because of our vestibular system. It is because of that sense of balance. So we have these different kinds of movements, as I was talking about, moving forward and backwards. But angular motion and tilt. Angular motion would be kind of rotating your head, as I mentioned, and tilt would be moving up and down. The book is going to refer to these things as roll, pitch, and yaw. If you are a flight pilot, if you have flown airplanes, you know these words very well. You don't need to know them for the class. Don't worry too much about what these are for the class. These are just showing you that there are different kinds of ways in which we can move, not only left, right, forward, backwards, up and down, but also rotations around the x-axis, rotations around the y-axis, and rotations around the z-axis. All right, so I want to end this particular video by asking you, why is it that if you've been riding in a car for 3 hours, let's say you're sitting in the passenger seat, do you feel like you're moving? You don't, right? Let's say that you're on the Mass Pike, there's no traffic, you're just driving down the turnpike. Do you feel like you're moving? Why not? So think about that question, and we will come back to that in the next video, talking about the anatomy of the vestibular system.